Picture this. It's 3:17 in the morning. You're lying there, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows dance across the room from the streetlight outside. Your mind is wide awake, but your body feels like it's been through a battle. The clock ticks louder than it ever did during the day. And you think to yourself, when did sleep become my enemy? My friend, if you're over 70 and this scene feels all too familiar, you're not alone. But what if I told you that the very things you've been doing to try to sleep better might actually be stealing your rest? What if the wisdom passed down through generations about sleep has been incomplete? I'm here today to share something that took me 7 decades to truly understand. Something that changed not just my nights, but my entire approach to the precious time we have left on this earth. Welcome, dear friends. I want you to imagine we're sitting together on my front porch, watching the sunset over the garden my late husband and I planted 43 years ago. The evening air is just cool enough to need a light sweater, and there's that particular quality of light that only comes at this time of day. Gentle, forgiving, wise. This is how I want our conversation to feel. Not like a lecture from some young doctor who's never lived through what we've lived through, but like a heart-to-heart between people who understand that every sunrise is a gift and every peaceful night's sleep is a treasure beyond measure. You see, I spent most of my adult life thinking I understood sleep. I raised 4 children, worked as a nurse for 37 years, and took care of my aging parents. I thought exhaustion was just part of life's natural rhythm. But somewhere in my early 70s, I realized I've been making critical mistakes. Mistakes that were robbing me of the restorative sleep my aging body desperately needed. Let me share a story that changed everything for me. It was a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years after my beloved William passed. I found myself in the emergency room, not because of any dramatic health crisis, but because I had fallen asleep while driving to the grocery store. Thank God, nothing terrible happened. But sitting in that sterile hospital room, with my daughter holding my hand and tears in her eyes, I realized something profound. I wasn't just tired. I was sleep-deprived in ways that were affecting every aspect of my remaining years. The young doctor who treated me was kind but clinical. He talked about sleep hygiene and medication options. But it was an older nurse, probably close to retirement herself, who pulled me aside and said something that changed my life. Honey, at our age, we can't afford to get sleep wrong. It's not just about being tired. It's about having the energy to live fully in whatever time we have left. That conversation started a journey of discovery that I want to share with you today. Because if you're over 70, the stakes of good sleep aren't just about feeling rested tomorrow. They're about preserving your independence, maintaining your relationships, keeping your mind sharp, and yes, extending both the quantity and quality of your remaining years. Today, I'm going to share 4 critical sleeping mistakes that we seniors make. Mistakes I made for years without realizing the damage they were causing. But more than that, I want to share the deeper wisdom these discoveries taught me about aging gracefully, about adapting to change, and about never giving up on improving our lives, no matter how many candles are on our birthday cake. Before we dive into these 4 mistakes, I want you to understand something important. This isn't about perfect sleep. At our age, perfection is an illusion that only leads to frustration. This is about better sleep. This is about reclaiming those precious hours of rest so we can show up fully for our grandchildren, our friends, our communities, and most importantly, for ourselves. As my grandmother used to say, "Child, you can't pour from an empty cup." At 70 plus, that cup isn't just about physical energy. It's about mental clarity, emotional resilience, and spiritual vitality. So settle in, dear friend. Let's explore these 4 mistakes together, and more importantly, let's discover how correcting them can transform not just your nights, but your entire approach to this beautiful, challenging chapter of life we call our golden years. Mistake number 1, maintaining the same bedtime routine from decades past. The first mistake, and perhaps the most common one I see among my peers, is clinging to the same bedtime routine we've used for the past 30, 40, or even 50 years. We're creatures of habit, and there's wisdom in routine. But what worked when we were 45 doesn't necessarily serve us at 75. Let me tell you about my friend Margaret. She's 78, sharp as a tack, and stubborn as a mule. For 40 years, Margaret's bedtime routine was sacred. Dinner at 6, Evening news at 7, a cup of chamomile tea at 8:30, and lights out by 9:15. This routine served her well through raising 3 children, managing a career as a high school principal, and caring for her husband through his final illness. But when Margaret started experiencing insomnia in her mid-70s, she doubled down on this routine, thinking consistency would solve the problem. She'd lie in bed, frustrated and anxious, watching the clock tick past 10, 11 midnight. The harder she tried to force sleep at 9:15, the more elusive it became. What Margaret didn't understand, what none of us were taught, is that our sleep needs and patterns naturally change as we age. Our circadian rhythms shift. We produce less melatonin. Our body temperature regulation changes. The deep sleep stages that came so easily in our younger years become shorter and more fragmented. Think of it this way. If you've been driving the same car for 40 years, you know exactly how it handles. When it needs maintenance, how to coax the best performance from it. But imagine if that car's engine changed every few years. When you need to adjust how you drive it, our bodies at 70 are not the same bodies we had at 40 or 50. They're not worse, they're different. And different requires adaptation, not rigidity. Margaret's breakthrough came when she finally agreed to work with a sleep specialist who understood aging. Instead of fighting her body's new rhythms, she learned to work with them. She discovered that her natural bedtime had shifted to around 10:30, and that trying to force sleep at 9:15 was actually training her brain to associate bedtime with anxiety and struggle. She also learned that her evening routine needed to account for changes in her digestion, her sensitivity to light, and yes, even the practical reality of an aging bladder. Her new routine became gentler, more flexible, more attuned to what her 78-year-old body actually needed. There's a profound life lesson here that goes beyond sleep. How many of us are clinging to approaches, expectations, and routines that once served us well, but may now be working against us? In our relationships, in our daily activities, in our expectations of ourselves? I think about the stories my grandmother told of her childhood on the farm. When the seasons changed, everything changed. The daily schedule, the type of work, the food they ate, even the social rhythms of the community. They didn't fight the seasons. They flowed with them. Aging is its own season, with its own requirements and its own gifts. When we try to maintain summer habits in the autumn of our lives, we create unnecessary struggle. But when we adapt, when we honor where we're now rather than clinging to where we used to be, we often discover new forms of peace and satisfaction we never expected. So how do you know if your bedtime routine needs updating? Start by paying attention without judgment. Keep a simple sleep journal for 2 weeks. Not to criticize yourself, but to gather information. When do you naturally feel sleepy? When do you naturally wake up? What activities in the evening leave you feeling calm versus agitated? Notice if you're trying to force sleep at a time when your body isn't ready. Notice if your routine includes activities that might be overstimulating your aging nervous system, like watching intense news programs or engaging in family phone calls about stressful topics right before bed. Margaret's new routine includes gentle stretching instead of the evening news, herbal tea chosen for relaxation rather than habit, and a flexible bedtime that honors her body's natural cues. She still values routine. Consistency remains important for good sleep, but it's a routine that serves her current needs rather than her past self. The result? Margaret now falls asleep within 20 minutes most nights, and more importantly, she's learned to trust her body's wisdom rather than fighting it. This shift in perspective has influenced other areas of her life too. She's more patient with her own pace of walking, more accepting of needing reading glasses, more willing to ask for help when she needs it. This is the beautiful paradox of aging wisely. The more we accept and adapt to our limitations, the more freedom we actually experience. When we stop fighting our bodies and start listening to them, we often find that they've been trying to guide us toward better health and deeper peace all along. Mistake number 2, ignoring the sacred balance of daytime activity and evening. The second mistake I see so often among my contemporaries, and one I made for years myself, is misunderstanding the relationship between how we spend our days and how we sleep at night. It's what I call ignoring the sacred balance between activity and stillness. I discovered this truth the hard way during what I now call my couch years. After William passed, I found myself gradually becoming more sedentary. Not dramatically. I still did my household chores, ran my errands, attended church on Sundays. But the long walks we used to take together ended. The garden projects that once energized me felt overwhelming. The social activities that required evening outings seemed too tiring. I told myself I was being sensible, conserving energy, taking care of myself. What I was actually doing was creating a cycle that was destroying my sleep and, without realizing it, accelerating my physical and mental decline. Here's what I learned. Our bodies are designed for movement, even at our age. When we don't get enough physical activity during the day, our bodies don't build up the natural fatigue that signals bedtime. It's like trying to drain a bathtub without ever turning on the faucet. There's simply not enough water to drain, but there's more to it than just physical tiredness. Regular movement during the day helps regulate our circadian rhythms, improves our mood, and processes the stress hormones that can keep us awake at night. Without adequate activity, these stress chemicals build up in our systems like silt in a river, creating mental restlessness even when our bodies feel tired. I think of my great-grandmother, who lived to be 96 and worked in her garden until she was 92. She would tell me, "Child, a body at rest stays at rest, but a body in motion can rest deeply." She understood instinctively what modern science is now proving, that appropriate movement during the day is essential for restorative sleep at night. But here's the other side of the equation that many of us get wrong. We fail to create proper evening stillness. I see so many of my friends who, having been relatively inactive during the day, try to compensate by cramming social activities, vigorous house cleaning, or intense mental stimulation into their evening hours. Let me tell you about my neighbor Frank. Frank is 74, a retired accountant, and one of the kindest men you'll ever meet. For the first few years after retirement, Frank struggled with restless nights and morning fatigue. His day typically involved light housework, some television, maybe a trip to the hardware store. But his evenings were packed. Elaborate dinner preparations, intense phone calls with his worried adult children, detailed financial planning, and what he called productive activities like reorganizing closets or balancing his checkbook. Frank thought he was being responsible, using his evening energy wisely. What he was actually doing was ramping up his nervous system, right when it needed to wind down. His mind would race with details, decisions, and concerns right up until bedtime, making it nearly impossible for his brain to transition into sleep mode. Frank's transformation began when his grandson, a college student studying psychology, asked him a simple question during a family dinner. "Grandpa, when do you give your mind permission to rest?" That question stopped Frank cold. He realized he'd been treating his retirement years like an extended weekend, cramming unfinished tasks and social obligations into every available moment. He hadn't considered that his aging mind and body might need deliberate, sacred time to transition from day into night. What Frank discovered, what I discovered, what so many of us need to learn, is that the balance between activity and stillness isn't just about physical rest. It's about honoring the natural rhythms that have governed human life for thousands of years. Our ancestors rose with the sun and settled with the darkness. Their days were filled with necessary movement, farming, walking, physical labor. Their evenings were naturally quiet, gentle conversation, simple tasks, early rest. They didn't have to think about this balance. It was built into the fabric of their lives. We, in our modern world, have lost this natural rhythm. We can be sedentary all day and then overstimulated all evening. We can avoid physical movement and wonder why our bodies don't know when to rest. We can fill our minds with information, concerns, and activities right up until we expect them to suddenly become peaceful and sleep-ready. So what does the sacred balance look like in practical terms for someone over 70? It's simpler than you might think, but it requires intentionality. For the daytime activity portion, this doesn't mean training for a marathon or joining an aggressive fitness program. It means moving your body enough to create natural, healthy fatigue. This might be a 20-minute walk in your neighborhood, gentle yoga or stretching, gardening, dancing to music in your living room, or even vigorous house cleaning. The key is consistency and progression. Start where you are, not where you think you should be. If a 5-minute walk around the block is challenging, start there and celebrate that achievement. If you can walk for 30 minutes, wonderful, But don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Frank now starts each day with a 15-minute walk, does his errands on foot when possible, and spends time working in his small garden. Nothing dramatic, but enough movement to create natural tiredness by evening. More importantly, Frank learned to create what he calls sunset time, the 2 hours before bedtime when he deliberately shifts into stillness mode. No financial planning, no stressful phone calls, no complex problem solving. Instead, he might read a familiar book, listen to gentle music, write in a gratitude journal, or simply sit on his porch and watch the world settle into evening. This balance between activity and stillness teaches us something profound about aging gracefully. We don't have to choose between being completely sedentary or pushing ourselves to exhaustion. We can find a middle path that honors both our need for movement and our need for rest. There's also a spiritual dimension to this balance that I didn't expect. When we move our bodies appropriately during the day, we connect with our physical selves in a positive way. When we create genuine stillness in the evening, we connect with our inner selves, our sense of peace, our gratitude for the day that has passed. This principle of balanced rhythm extends far beyond sleep. Think about the balance between social time and solitude, between engaging with the world and turning inward, between giving to others and receiving from them. So many of us struggle with finding these balances as we age. We might isolate ourselves too much, losing the stimulation that keeps us mentally sharp. Or we might overschedule ourselves, trying to prove we're still vital and relevant, but exhausting ourselves in the process. The wisdom of the activity-stillness balance can guide us in all these areas. I've come to think of this balance like the seasons. Spring requires activity, growth, reaching outward. Summer sustains that energy. But autumn calls for a different rhythm. Still active, but more reflective, more selective, more focused on harvesting the fruits of earlier efforts. And winter, with its deep rest and turning inward, prepares us for the next cycle of growth. We need daily seasons too. Morning and midday for gentle activity and engagement. Evening for reflection and settling. Night for deep rest and restoration. When we honor these rhythms, our whole lives flow more smoothly. So I invite you to consider, what does your daily rhythm look like? Are you giving your body enough appropriate movement to create natural fatigue? Are you giving your mind enough peaceful transition time to prepare for rest? This isn't about perfection. Some days you'll move more, some days less. Some evenings will be busier, some quieter. The goal is awareness and gentle intentionality, not rigid rules. Remember, we're not trying to recreate the energy patterns of our younger selves. We're trying to find a rhythm that serves us now, in this season of our lives, with wisdom and compassion for our current needs and limitations. Mistake number 3. The medication trap, when pills become prisons. The third mistake, my dear friends, is perhaps the most heartbreaking one I see in our age group. It's what I call the medication trap. When the very pills we turn for sleep end up imprisoning us in cycles that rob us of the natural, restorative rest our bodies crave. Now, before I share this story, I want to be crystal clear. I am not a doctor, and I would never suggest that anyone stop taking medications without professional guidance. What I am is someone who lived through this trap myself, and someone who has watched too many dear friends lose years of their lives to a well-intentioned but ultimately harmful dependency on sleep medications. Let me take you back to the winter after William's funeral. I was 71 years old, grieving deeply, and facing the longest, loneliest nights of my life. Sleep became elusive, not just because of sadness, but because of anxiety about being alone, worries about my future, and the strange sounds an empty house makes at 2 a.m. My family doctor, a kind man who had known me for 15 years, prescribed what he called a temporary solution, a sleeping pill to help me through the worst of my grief. Just until I adjusted, he said, just to help me function during the day. Those first few nights with the medication felt like a miracle. I would take the pill at 9 o'clock, and by 10, a gentle fog would settle over my racing thoughts. Sleep would come, and for 8 hours, I could escape the sharp edges of my new reality. For the first month, it seemed like the perfect solution. I was getting sleep, functioning better during the day, and managing the overwhelming practical tasks that come with losing a spouse of 47 years. But here's what no one told me about sleep medications, especially for people our age. They don't actually restore you the way natural sleep does. They sedate you. There's a crucial difference. Natural sleep moves through distinct stages: light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, each serving different purposes for physical healing, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. Medication-induced sleep tends to be flatter, less varied, less restorative. I began to notice that even after 8 hours of medicated sleep, I would wake up feeling foggy, disconnected, not quite myself. My balance seemed off. My memory felt fuzzy. Simple tasks took more effort than they should have. Worse, after about 6 weeks, the pills stopped working as effectively. What had been a reliable 8 hours of sleep became 6, then 5, then restless stretches of half-consciousness punctuated by worry about whether the medication was still in my system. My doctor increased the dose. The cycle repeated. The effectiveness faded. My anxiety about sleep, which the pills were supposed to solve, actually increased because now I was terrified of facing a night without medication. 6 months into what was supposed to be a temporary solution, I made a disturbing discovery. I wasn't just dependent on the pills for sleep. I was afraid to feel my own feelings without pharmaceutical buffer. The medication hadn't just been helping me sleep. It had been helping me avoid the necessary work of grieving, adjusting, and finding new ways to cope with my changed life. Let me tell you about my dear friend Dorothy, because her story illustrates an even more dangerous version of this trap. Dorothy started taking sleep aids after her hip replacement at age 76. The pain and discomfort made natural sleep difficult, and the medication seemed like a reasonable short-term solution. But Dorothy's situation was complicated by other age-related factors. She was also taking medications for blood pressure, arthritis, and mild anxiety. Her body was processing medications differently than it had in her younger years. Her liver and kidneys weren't clearing drugs as efficiently. What Dorothy and her doctors didn't initially account for was how sleep medications can interact with other drugs, and how these interactions can be particularly dangerous for people over 70. Sleep aids can increase fall risk, worsen cognitive function, and interfere with the natural sleep architecture that's already challenged by aging. Dorothy began experiencing what she called fuzzy days, mornings when she felt disconnected, afternoons when her thinking seemed slow, evenings when she couldn't remember conversations from earlier in the day. She attributed these symptoms to aging, not realizing they were side effects of her medication regimen. Dorothy's wake-up call came when she fell in her kitchen one morning, not from dizziness or weakness, but from what her doctor later identified as medication-induced cognitive impairment. She simply forgot to lift her foot high enough to clear the threshold between rooms. The fall didn't cause serious injury, but it forced Dorothy and her family to examine what was really going on. When they listed all her medications and began researching interactions and side effects, they were horrified by what they found. Here's what I learned through my own experience and Dorothy's. Our aging bodies process medications very differently than younger bodies do. Our liver function, kidney function, and metabolism all slow down. This means medications stay in our systems longer, accumulate to higher levels, and can cause effects that wouldn't occur in someone 20 or 30 years younger. Sleep medications, in particular, can remain active in our systems well into the following day, causing what researchers call hangover effects, drowsiness, confusion, impaired balance, and reduced cognitive function. There's also something called rebound insomnia, when stopping sleep medication causes worse insomnia than the original problem. This creates a vicious cycle where people feel they can't live without the pills, even when the pills aren't really helping anymore. My own journey away from sleep medication was gradual and guided by a geriatric specialist who understood the complexities of helping older adults reduce their dependence on these drugs. It wasn't easy. There were nights of poor sleep, days of anxiety, moments when I questioned whether I was making the right choice. But what I discovered on the other side was profound. My natural sleep, while different from my younger years, was actually more restorative than medicated sleep had been. My days became clearer, my balance improved, and most importantly, I began to develop confidence in my own ability to cope with difficult nights and challenging emotions. I also realized that the medication had been preventing me from doing the necessary emotional work of grief. When I stopped buffering my feelings with pills, I was finally able to fully process my loss, find new sources of comfort and meaning, and develop healthier coping strategies. Dorothy's medication reduction took place over several months under careful medical supervision. She worked with pharmacists who specialized in geriatric medications, a sleep specialist, and a counselor who helped her develop non-pharmaceutical ways to manage anxiety and promote sleep. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was remarkable. Dorothy's thinking became clearer, her balance improved, and her confidence in her own capabilities returned. Most importantly, she regained trust in her body's ability to sleep naturally, even if that sleep looked different than it had in her younger years. This experience taught me something crucial about aging. There's often a temptation to solve age-related challenges with quick fixes rather than adaptive solutions. We might think, I'm too old to learn new ways of managing this problem, or a pill is simpler than changing my habits. But quick fixes, especially pharmaceutical ones, often create new problems while masking rather than solving the original ones. The adaptive solutions, while requiring more patience and effort initially, tend to serve us much better in the long run. So what are the alternatives to sleep medication for seniors? The list is longer and more effective than you might expect. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia has been shown to be more effective than medication for long-term sleep improvement, especially in older adults. Relaxation techniques, meditation, and gentle yoga can address both the physical and mental aspects of sleep difficulties. Creating optimal sleep environments, managing light exposure, and timing food and fluid intake all have powerful effects on natural sleep patterns. There's also a spiritual dimension to reclaiming natural sleep, learning to be present with difficult feelings, to sit with anxiety without immediately medicating away, to trust in your body's wisdom even when it's different from what it used to be. These are profound spiritual practices that can enrich your entire life, not just your sleep. I'm not suggesting that everyone over 70 should stop taking sleep medications. Some people genuinely need them for medical reasons that go beyond simple insomnia. But I am suggesting that if you're taking sleep aids, it's worth having an honest conversation with a healthcare provider about whether they're still serving you well. Ask questions. How long have I been on these medications? What are the risks and benefits for some of my age? Are there non-pharmaceutical approaches I haven't tried? What would a gradual reduction program look like? It takes courage to question medical interventions, especially when you're afraid of sleepless nights. But remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting wisely in spite of fear. And sometimes the wisest action is choosing short-term discomfort in service of long-term health and freedom. The beautiful truth is that our bodies, even at 70 plus, retain remarkable capacity for healing and adaptation. When we remove obstacles to natural sleep and provide appropriate support, our innate sleep mechanisms often work better than we expected. This doesn't mean perfect sleep. At our age, perfect anything is usually an illusion, but it means better sleep, more natural sleep, sleep that serves rather than sedates us. And that, my friends, is a gift worth pursuing. Mistake number 4, fighting the darkness instead of dancing with it. The fourth and final mistake, and perhaps the most poetic one to understand, is what I call fighting the darkness instead of dancing with it. This isn't just about the literal darkness of night, though that's part of it. This is about our relationship with the unknowns, the uncertainties, and yes, the approaching twilight of our own lives. At 70 plus, sleep often becomes a battleground where our deepest fears play out. Fear of death, fear of losing our independence, fear of becoming burdens to our families. We lie awake at 3 a.m. not just because of physical discomfort, but because darkness has a way of amplifying every worry, every regret, every anxious thought about tomorrow. Many of us respond to this by fighting the wakefulness, fighting the anxious thoughts, fighting the very experience of being awake in the dark. We turn on lights, reach for phones, try to distract ourselves back into unconsciousness. What we rarely consider is that this fight itself might be what's keeping us awake. Let me tell you about Anna, my neighbor across the street. Anna is 82, a former librarian, and one of the most intellectually vibrant people I know. But for several years, Anna dreaded bedtime with an intensity that was affecting her entire life. Anna's sleep troubles began after a series of losses. Her sister, her best friend, and her beloved cat of 15 years, all within the span of 18 months. But the issue wasn't just grief. Anna had developed what she called the 3 a.m. terrors. Every night, like clockwork, Anna would wake around 3 a.m. with her mind racing through a catalog of fears. What if she had a stroke and no one found her for days? What if her savings ran out? What if she became one of those elderly people who died alone and forgotten? What if the chest pain she felt yesterday was a heart attack? Anna's response was to fight these thoughts and feelings with every tool she could think of. She would turn on every light in the house, make coffee, turn on the television, call the late-night prayer line at her church. She would exhaust herself trying to push away the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, until she finally collapsed back into sleep near dawn. This pattern was exhausting Anna physically, but more than that, it was exhausting her spiritually. She began to dread sunset because it meant bedtime was coming. She started avoiding evening activities because she was always tired from her nightly battles with darkness. Anna was fighting a war she could never win because she was fighting against fundamental aspects of the human experience: uncertainty, mortality, and the natural rhythms of consciousness that include both light and shadow. Anna's transformation began with a conversation we had one spring afternoon in her garden. She looked exhausted, and when I asked how she was sleeping, the whole story poured out. But then she said something that caught my attention. "I feel like I'm fighting a war every night, and I don't even know who the enemy is." I asked her a question that surprised us both. What if there is no enemy? What if the darkness is not something to fight, but something to be with? Think about it this way. When you're in a beautiful garden at night, you don't fight the darkness. You might light a gentle lamp to see the path, but you also appreciate how the darkness makes the stars visible, how it brings out the fragrance of night-blooming flowers, how it creates a completely different but equally valid experience of the same space you know in daylight. What if our nighttime wakefulness could be approached the same way, not as something to battle, but as a different state of consciousness with its own gifts and possibilities? I share with Anna a practice I had learned from a meditation teacher many years earlier, before I fully understood its relevance to sleep. It's called being present with what is, not trying to change or fix or escape from your current experience, but simply being with it with as much kindness and curiosity as you can manage. For Anna, this meant that when she woke at 3 a.m. with anxious thoughts, instead of immediately fighting to get back to sleep, she would first acknowledge what was actually happening. I'm awake. I'm having worried thoughts. My heart is beating a little fast. I'm feeling scared about the future. Then, instead of turning on all the lights and trying to distract herself, Anna learned to respond gently to her own experience. She would sit up in bed, perhaps light one small lamp, and practice what she came to call befriending the darkness. This wasn't about wallowing in anxiety or giving in to despair. It was about treating her worried, wakeful self with the same compassion she would offer a frightened child. She would wrap herself in a soft blanket, maybe make some herbal tea, and simply acknowledge, yes, these are big concerns. Yes, aging brings uncertainties. And yes, you're handling this the best you can. What Anna discovered amazed her. When she stopped fighting her 3 a.m. wakefulness and instead approached it with gentleness, several things happened. First, the intense anxiety that came with being awake began to diminish. Much of her distress, she realized, wasn't actually about her worries. It was about her resistance to having worries. Second, she began to notice that her wakeful periods in the darkness often brought insights, memories, and a sense of spiritual connection that she never experienced during the busy daylight hours. Anna, being a thoughtful woman, began to research the spiritual traditions around darkness and night consciousness. She discovered that many contemplative traditions actually value the quiet, wakeful hours of early morning as times of special spiritual significance. She learned about the Christian tradition of vigils, where monks and nuns wake in the deep night for prayer and contemplation. She read about how many indigenous cultures viewed the hours between midnight and dawn as times when the veil between worlds is thinnest, when wisdom and healing can flow more easily. This research helped Anna reframe her experience entirely. Instead of seeing her 3 a.m. wakefulness as a sleep disorder, she began to see it as an invitation to a different kind of spiritual practice. Instead of fighting to return to unconsciousness, she began to explore what consciousness had to offer during these quiet, dark hours. Anna's new practice became beautifully simple. When she woke in the night, she would acknowledge her wakefulness with gratitude rather than frustration. Thank you for